So y'all remember Gods and Monsters? This was a game that Ubisoft announced back in E3 2019 with a cinematic trailer. It had Greek mythology motif in terms of visuals, and a lot of people were reminded of Breath of the Wild based on that trailer. Well, the game now returns with a different name. It's called Immortals: Fenyx Rising. Ubisoft felt like the game took enough of a different direction since its announcement that they needed to rebrand it. I got to play 2.5 hours of it during a Ubisoft preview event. The demo comprised of a main quest thread involving lighting up a forge, and then I got to fight a boss battle. I completed that in about an hour, and then the rest of my time I spent exploring the map and doing side activities. And I've got to say, this is actually the most intrigued I've been for a Ubisoft game in a long time. If you saw my past impressions video of Ubisoft titles, you know that I wasn't blown away by Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Watch Dogs Legion. This game, though, I straight up didn't want to stop playing. It gave me that feeling where time flew by, and by the time the demo ended, I really just wanted to play more. I was disappointed I couldn't play more, so that's a good feeling to have for a game. So, at its core, this game is basically, I would say, 75% Breath of the Wild and 25% Assassin's Creed. There is definitely a huge Breath of the Wild inspiration. It's not very subtle at all, and the developer straight up admitted it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you can do something unique with it. The art style definitely has Breath of the Wild vibes to it, with that cel-shaded painting look, but with a bit more of a Fortnite-esque cartooniness and a Greek mythology coat of paint. There is a huge open world that you can explore in its entirety from the outset, according to developers, kind of like how you could in Breath of the Wild. Your fastest and most efficient form of navigation will be through aerial gliding, like in Breath of the Wild, though you now have abilities like speed boosting while gliding and diving capabilities, which are welcome additions. I do wish that you could glide backwards, though, for finer aerial control for certain platforming segments or for certain obstacle courses. The only way to go backwards from what I played was to circle around, and it made gliding harder to control than it needed to be sometimes. But generally, gliding is very similar to Breath of the Wild in functionality and purpose. There is a stamina bar that plays a major role and governs many aspects of gameplay and sets limitations to balance capabilities like gliding, sprinting, climbing, and combat abilities. You can climb almost any surface like in Breath of the Wild if you've got the stamina for it. There's a strong emphasis on finding some kind of high place to scout your surroundings, to find interesting landmarks or points of interest, and just kind of go where your heart takes you. And even smaller stuff like being able to tame wild horses is taken straight out of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And the game even has just straight up its own version of Breath of the Wild shrines called Vaults of Tartaros. Much like shrines, these vaults are mini dungeons that provide various challenges, be it obstacle courses, puzzles, and or combat challenges. And I did a couple of these vaults in the demo, and they were actually not bad at all. I'll admit that I never found any of the ones I did in this game to match or be as clever as Breath of the Wild shrines. The puzzles could feel rather basic, and there seemed to be a stronger emphasis on platforming and traversal rather than puzzles. But then again, I've only seen a handful of these, so maybe they'll get cooler and more intricate as I go along. They weren't bad by any means. They were still really nice and decently fun distractions. Now, I keep making comparisons to Breath of the Wild, but Immortals does distinguish itself in a number of ways, and combat in particular feels very different from Breath of the Wild. The control scheme is actually very close to the newer Assassin's Creed games, so the right shoulder and trigger buttons are light and heavy attacks respectively. You've got a dodge button with perfect dodging making everything go slow motion. You can parry by pressing both shoulder buttons together at the right time. You can also hold the left trigger to aim with your bow and arrow at any given time. And then holding down the left shoulder button will bring up a radio menu of special abilities called godly powers in this game. Now, while the control scheme is similar to Assassin's Creed, the feel and design of combat is very different from that franchise. Combat in Immortals: Fenyx Rising feels faster paced, it's flashier, more extravagant, more actiony if that makes sense, designed around comboing a la Devil May Cry, and actually can be quite a bit of fun. The special abilities in this game, again known as godly powers in particular, feel really good to use. So for melee combat, there are 5 special abilities or godly powers. You've got this powerful giant hammer strike called Hephaestus' Hammer. There's this shield dash attack called Athena's Dash. There's this uppercut move that summons a bunch of spikes from the ground. There's this magical grapple that allows you to close distances with enemies. And you have the ability to summon your Fenyx companion to attack enemies from a distance with fiery projectiles. And then there's one more ability that's centered around the bow and arrow, and this allows you to control the trajectory of the arrow. And this is more useful for puzzle solving than combat from what I've found. From what I understand, these 6 special abilities are the only ones you'll have for the entire game, but they are also going to be upgradable, so that keeps things fresh. The game essentially seems to go for quality of abilities over quantity, focusing on fleshing out a few specialized skills for players to gain mastery over, rather than bombarding you with a bunch of abilities that you may or may not end up using. So it's similar to Breath of the Wild in that way, which you may recall focused on a few runes like bombs, magnesis, stasis, and cryonis that the entire game was built around. And in Immortals, every godly power, every special ability felt useful for different situations and flowed really well with combat. In this game, it is paramount to combine light, heavy, and aerial attacks while making use of these godly powers and while dodging and parrying as needed, and it was all very satisfying to pull off once I got the hang of combat. I actually looked and felt pretty kick-ass. I also like how instead of the godly power special abilities running on a cooldown, they rely on and spend stamina instead. They can be activated in any sequence, in any order, at any time, so long as you have stamina. So if there's this particular ability that's useful in an encounter, you can use that ability twice in a row rather than using it once, then having to wait for a cooldown and having to use all of your other abilities that may not be as useful while you wait for that cooldown to run down. And I generally liked the tactical nature of always having to be conscious about managing your stamina during combat, so that discouraged me from spamming my abilities and actually forced me to use them in a measured way, actually gauge when's the right time to use them. Because if I use a special ability while my stamina is low, the ability activates, but my stamina bar turns red and actually goes into negative, and I actually have to wait for that negative stamina to run out before I can start recovering positive stamina that allows me to use abilities again. So there is an associated risk with using abilities too many times in a row and spamming them thoughtlessly. But fortunately, the game does still encourage aggression, and you'll be using these abilities often because you can recover stamina with basic attacks or by performing perfect dodges and parries when battling enemies. So by mixing up basic attacks and employing godly powers when appropriate, it always felt like I was in flow with combat. And generally, the game rewards skillful, measured, and at the same time aggressive execution of both basic attacks and godly powers attacks. There's also a big emphasis on aerial combat in this game that gives it a bit of that, again, Devil May Cry vibe. It's not quite that intricate, but there is enough of that where juggling enemies can feel satisfying. Smaller enemies in particular can be launched in the air with certain attacks, and they can be juggled and comboed to satisfactory effect. Larger enemies cannot be launched and juggled from what I saw in this demo. These encounters feel maybe more like Dark Souls encounters where you have to kind of gauge their attacks and dodge or parry appropriately and attack at appropriate times. It's definitely easier and far less punishing than Dark Souls encounters, but it feels a bit like that here and there. Another key aspect of combat is building up an enemy's stagger meter to stun them for a good amount of time. So basic attacks and godly powers all will build up that meter if you land strikes, and then on top of that, parrying will especially do a number on their stagger meter. And once an enemy is staggered, they'll just kind of stay there stunned, and you can really wail at them, do a ton of damage by combining basic attacks and godly powers. So there are a number of layers to combat that kept it consistently engaging and fun. If there were a couple of flaws that I should mention, I would say that I do wish that some of the basic attacks felt a bit more impactful. I think that if the sound effects for the basic attacks had a bit more oomph to them, it would go a long way in making them feel more impactful. And I also did have trouble with the game's Z-targeting or lock-on system. Basically, the lock indicator is this light yellow color, and it's very hard to see more often than not, and so it was often hard for me to tell who I was locked onto. And it didn't help matters that the way the camera moves when you snap to a different target is so smooth, it doesn't snap to a changed target, and so that made it harder to tell if I was locked on to a different target and who exactly I was locked on to. So hopefully adjustments can be made to lock on so it feels snappier, so it's easier to tell who you're actually targeting at any given moment. But in the grand scheme of things, overall, I found the game's combat system to be very enjoyable, and combat was further bolstered by a good amount of enemy variety with lively and appealing designs and animations, and with their visual appearance, of course, inspired by Greek mythology. And each actually had their own unique attack patterns. Each enemy type felt like a unique foe. Now, having only played 2.5 hours of the game, it's hard to tell if this enemy variety will carry across the entire experience or if I'm going to start seeing a lot of repeat enemies. I'll have to wait for the final game for that, but at the very least, the enemies that I got to battle in this demo, there was enough variety where I felt entertained, where encounters felt fresh enough. Beyond combat, as you perform activities in the game, you will see your character progress. So here's a bit of a surprise. There's no leveling in this game, in this Ubisoft game. Progression happens entirely through the acquisition of weapons, armor, and gear found and scattered throughout the land, and you'll also find various crafting materials to upgrade various facets of your character. So as far as weapons and gear goes, there are swords for light attacks, axes for heavy attacks, bows for ranged attacks, there are different cosmetics for the wings used for gliding, and you have helmet and breastplate for armor slots. From what I understand, your light attack will always be a sword, and your heavy attacks will always be an axe, but there are different types of swords and axes with different stats and effects that you'll be able to acquire and customize your character with. The game's just focused on you mastering the sword light attacks and the axe heavy attacks, which you can combine with godly powers to great effect. Gear in this game isn't the usual barrage of loot that kind of grant these minor incremental upgrades. Instead, you earn fewer gear that feel more substantial as you complete quests and loot chests found throughout the world and in the vaults of Tartarus. So the focus seems to be on tailoring your playstyle by having different gear types that grant different perks, rather than boosting some arbitrary power level that you need to increase in order to overcome certain level gates. So, as an example, there's this one sword I found that focused on boosting my stamina, whereas another sword, the one that I started with, focused on extra damage and health recovery. Both are viable options, it's just a matter of what your playstyle leans towards. As another example, there's this one helmet I found that focused on boosting the giant hammer godly power, and then there's another one that focused on boosting my basic sword light attacks. There's a bow I found that focused on stunning and freezing enemies, another one focused on dealing extra damage by building up combos, and one more focused on extra damage and health. And this is just generally my preferred approach to gear: quality over quantity, different gears that tailor play styles rather than gear that just increases a number by a bit and has you constantly discarding old gear and cycling through different equipment. Beyond weapons and gear, you've got crafting materials that boost various facets of your character. There are 8 types of crafting material total that are used for different purposes. So there's ambrosia, found through exploration, which can be used to upgrade your max health. There's Zeus's lightning, found by completing Vaults of Tartarus, and which can be used to upgrade your max stamina. There is coins of Charon, found by completing myth challenges, these puzzle and obstacle course areas found in the open world. And these are basically your skill points, used to upgrade skills and godly powers. And skills, by the way, are basic and core maneuvers that can be upgraded with enhanced effects and new moves, separate from godly powers, which are your powerful special abilities that can be used during combat. And then another crafting material is what are called golden ambers, found by cutting down glowing tree stumps, and these can be used to upgrade your 4 potion types mapped to your D-pad. There's the health potion, the stamina potion, the defense potion, potion and the attack potion, each of which have their own skill trees essentially to boost their effects to a certain extent. And speaking of potions, you can only carry a limited amount, and when you spend them, you more often than not will have to craft specific potion types by going to the specific stations where potions are specifically crafted, and you spend ingredients found in the open world like certain mushrooms and fruits. And then finally, for crafting materials, there are 4 types of adamantine shards, all found by looting chests or from shard clusters that you'll find throughout the world. And there is the yellow shard that can be used to upgrade your carrying capacity for potions and arrows. And then there are the blue, red, and purple shards that can be used in different combinations to upgrade weapons, armor, and helmets, and unlock additional perks for them, which is what upgrading gear does. So progression in Immortals is straight up just about finding and doing stuff in the open world, acquiring crafting materials by engaging in activities rather than grinding for stuff like experience points and incremental gear upgrades to boost some arbitrary power level. And it all just makes the rewards loop and the activities in the open world more satisfying. And speaking of the open world, what I saw in the demo was only one of 7 major regions which are interconnected and seamlessly integrated. So see all that space on the bottom left there? So that's stuff that I couldn't explore at all. If I reach the edge of the region that the demo confined me to, I would stumble upon a wall that I'm assuming won't be there in the final game. It's just more for the purposes of the demo. And each of the 7 regions are apparently going to be themed after a different Greek god, and the goal of this game is that each region will be visually and thematically unique. The region I got to explore for the demo was the Forge Lands, this fire and industrial themed area where you'll find these forges and fiery creatures and automatons. Exploration can take place on foot by walking and running or climbing. It can happen in the air through the gliding mechanic, or it can happen on horseback for faster ground navigation. And you can also fast travel to discovered and completed areas on the map to expedite things, which is nice. I found that the game world generally provides a good amount of high places that can be used to scout the area and spot points of interest, or to glide off of to head in a direction at a faster pace. And this one region alone felt like there was a good amount of different enemies to fight and activities to partake in. We'll see if the rest of the regions offer a similar level of variety. As I mentioned before, in the open world, I did some main quests as well as some side activities. As far as the main quest goes, that revolved around lighting these 4 furnaces to start up a forge, and that eventually culminated in a boss battle. And after that, I got this visual set piece in the open world where the main villain is kind of pissed off and creating this spectral energy typhoon of some sort, and that's around where the main quest ended. And then outside the main quest, of course, there were plenty of side activities as I explored the world. Side activity types included things like the Vaults of Tartarus, again, the equivalent of Breath of the Wild shrines, these instance mini-dungeons where you solve puzzles, overcome obstacle courses, and or engage in combat trials. And then out about in the open world, you'll also find these challenge areas known as myth challenges, which I briefly mentioned before, which is how you earn the coins of Charon that upgrade your skills and godly powers. I found 3 types of myth challenges in my 2.5 hour demo. Navigation myth challenge, which are gliding obstacle courses, and constellation myth challenges, which involve physics-based puzzles that have you rolling balls around and situating them in slots in the appropriate places that will unlock the reward of this myth challenge. There was one that was a wit challenge that involved putting together a picture puzzle. Don't know how many other different types of myth challenges there will be in this game, but these are the ones that I found so far. You can also find epic chest landmarks throughout the world. As the name suggests, the goal is to open these chests that will yield a substantial new weapon or gear. And some are locked behind challenges like having to defeat all the enemies guarding the chest, and others will see you solving these mini puzzles and smaller dungeons in order to finally get to the chest. And then Vaults of Tartarus also each have a hidden epic chest in them that you can find and loot. And beyond that, the open world is of course home to various enemies that you'll find scattered that you can choose to fight. There are the usual regular enemies that roam around and respawn. There are also what are called mythic fiends, which are basically optional boss battles like this giant Cyclops, and defeating mythical fiends will yield rewards like new gear. So defeating this Cyclops, for example, yielded a brand new bow. Occasionally, you'll attract the attention of the main villain, Typhon, who will, as the game puts it, unleash his rage by sending hordes of enemies to hunt you down. So yeah, there was just a good amount of things to do in the time I spent with this game, and whether this game succeeds or not will depend on how much variety they can add to these activities, how much more intricate and interesting and compelling they can continue to make them. If they can keep these core activities feeling fresh, then the game will certainly go a long way. Visually, the world itself is actually really pretty to look at. While the game I wouldn't say pushes the boundaries of graphics on a technical level, the art style I think more than makes up for it. The world and just the entire visual aesthetic is very colorful and animated. There's a good amount of personality and charm oozing from the game. All of the animations I found are well done. The particle effects are pretty cool and really well implemented. And I love the impactful visual and audio effects of finishing off an enemy. And when you find a mountaintop or something and look at the world beyond, you look at the vistas and they can be quite beautiful, and you can spot a lot of interesting looking landmarks and architectures that are dotted throughout the world. Yeah, the game's just generally visually appealing and artistically impressive, even if technically a little dated and perhaps not the most original of art styles. Still, it does enough unique stuff with the Greek mythology coat of paint that it does feel like a different game, all things considered. And the music also kicks in at appropriate moments. The music I found to be pretty decent and provided the right mood and atmosphere at the right time as was required. Last but not least, I want to talk about story. Basically, the synopsis of the game is that you are Fenyx, a fully customizable character on a quest to reclaim the fallen home of the Greek gods, the Golden Isle, which is the setting of the game. And so you have to save the gods from their cursed status, reach Olympus, and defeat the main villain, the god destroyer Typhon, who has freed himself from imprisonment and ravaged the realm seeking vengeance. I suspect that the story of this game will be pretty simple and typical, the usual, save the lands from evil type of scenario. I don't expect anything in the way of mind-blowing character development or anything of the sort. You can tell that the plot is just there to set up the gameplay more than anything. It's not here to tell an emotional, riveting, dramatic story per se. Now, a narrative choice worth mentioning with this game is that throughout the campaign, you'll hear Zeus and Prometheus narrate and commentate on what's happening in the game, and this is dialogue that is very lighthearted, silly, comedic, fourth wall breaking, a lot of just joking around.
So gargantuan, so spectacularly crafty, so over it. Just get a room already.
I found that the jokes were hit or miss. I don't know how prominent this commentary will be in the final game, because there was a lot of commentary that was made specifically for this demo.
I'd be listening to your story for days. It's called dramatic effect. It's called where's my skip button. It is actually pronounced Ubisoft. The French.
There was some commentary that as you were playing the game, maybe you'd get some background and history about some of the mythology and about the world, and that was nice. But the comedic stuff maybe became a bit much at times, and not the best written material. And I feel like the commentary and narration will be okay as long as it's there in moderation, as long as the final game doesn't overindulge on that to the point where it becomes maybe annoying and distracting to the game's atmosphere, but we'll see how that plays out. With all that said, the bottom line here is that I'm actually excited to play this Ubisoft game. The only question I have right now is if Ubisoft can take the 2.5 hours compelling experience I had with this demo and keep that fresh for a few dozen hours or however long this game is meant to be. So will the game's puzzles and obstacle courses evolve in intricacy, or will they feel like copy and paste jobs in the long run? Will enemy variety, boss battles, and character progression keep combat fresh, interesting, and exciting throughout the entire span of the game? Will world exploration fill me with wonder from beginning to end, with cool and interesting discoveries and points of interest that I'll find throughout the world for the whole experience? Will this game focus on density over volume, on quality over quantity, on a tight package instead of one that stretches itself way too thin, as other Ubisoft titles have done in the past? Obviously, I don't have the answer to these questions, but from what I played in this game, I feel optimistic. I'm really digging what I played here. I am legitimately excited to play more of this game. I am actually going to keep a close eye on it and really hope and pray that all the positive impressions that I got from the 2.5 hours demo is going to be maintained for the entirety of the campaign. The game does come out on December 3rd, 2020, so as of the publishing of this video, a little less than 3 months for developers to finish this game. Technically speaking, I didn't find a whole lot of technical issues, a few visual glitches here and there, nothing major, nothing worth being overly concerned about. I feel like the game is in a good place, and hopefully with the 3 months that they have with the game's development, they'll be able to flesh everything out, polish a couple things, change some stuff like the way lock-on works right now, and enhance it visually so that it's more obvious who I'm locking on to. Maybe work on the gliding mechanics a little bit so you can glide backwards and make it easier to control that aspect. Other than that, though, I don't have many complaints about this game, though. The final verdict will be up to how the final experience ends up being, how the entire game across its dozens of hours will pan out, whether it's a compelling experience from beginning to end rather than just in a 2.5 hour portion of the game. For now, though, this is what I have to say about the game. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are based on the impressions you have heard, based on the footage you've seen. Are you excited for this game? Is this something you're interested in checking out, or is this a pass for you? Drop a comment, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.